Jeanette, for that introduction, and to Will and the Northeast CASC for the invitation to speak today, and for everyone who's here this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to get to talk about this project and this paper, both in terms of what we found, but starting to think about what implications it has for managing ecosystems in the Northeast. And this is a paper that was published earlier this year in PNAS. All of my fantastic co-authors are here on the title slide with me. So I'm here talking with you today, but really I want to acknowledge the input of all of these people into this project. Without them, it would not have been possible. And the motivation for this project really came down to trying to acknowledge and understand the interactions between global environmental changes that are occurring in the Northeast and around the world, and the ecological effects that those changes are having. So we often think about climate change, we think about invasive species, we can think about pollution or nitrogen deposition as an example. And each one of these changes independently has its own effects on individuals, on populations, on communities, and on ecosystems. But we also know that any given ecosystem is experiencing multiple stressors. And so it was an open question as to whether there were additive effects of these multiple stressors, whether there were stronger or weaker effects than we might expect from these individual stressors alone. And really the question was, can we be predictive in any way about this? And at the time of the inception of this project, there was a growing collection of studies that had looked at interactions of invasive species and other types of global environmental changes. So there was evidence emerging that the impacts were perhaps additive. There were other studies that would suggest that the impacts were smaller than we should expect from each stressor alone. And there were yet more studies that would suggest that we should expect bigger impacts or synergistic impacts from multiple stressors on ecosystems. And so it really became time to ask the question, well, from a synthetic perspective, what does this collection of studies tell us? And quite simply, we aimed to answer three straightforward on the surface questions. The first was, how do invasive species and global environmental changes affect ecosystems? So in studies independently, what effects should we expect? Second, and this was really the genesis and the main motivation for this project, was how do invasive species and other global environmental changes interact? And then finally, can we explain any observed variation in those effects? And we approached these research questions using a meta-analysis, which quite simply is a study of studies. So it's taking an existing body of literature and searching for emergent trends from all of that literature. So instead of looking at case studies as our body of evidence, it's trying to take a quantitative approach to what the collection of studies has found. And so in order to conduct a meta-analysis, it requires a standardized literature search so that it's replicable. It also requires a set of inclusion criteria from that standardized literature search. And the inclusion criteria that we developed for this study was that any candidate study had to have manipulated and then reported the ecological effects of one or more invasive species, one or more global environmental change, so abiotic global environmental change, the effects of the invasive species and the global environmental change together to allow us to assess the interaction, and then a control treatment. And so the image on the right-hand side of the screen is a sort of graphical or cartoon representation of what an experimental design might look like for a study that was a candidate to be included in this meta-analysis. And so some of you might recognize this as sort of a traditional ANOVA type design. In addition to the required measured responses and required treatments, the studies also needed to report the mean sum variance metric and a sample size for each of those treatments in order for us to be able to include it in a quantitative analysis. This is a diagram that outlines the filtering of candidate papers that we came across. So we started with a pool of over 6,000 potential papers from our original standardized literature searches. That then, through subsequent screenings and assessments of the full text for those inclusion criteria, got filtered down to 95 papers that were included ultimately in the quantitative analysis. So for those 95 papers, we extracted a variety of metrics from each one. So we extracted the treatment effects and the sample sizes. So what did they actually measure? We characterized the mechanism of impact of the invasive species that was included. These were generally based on ICAT criteria, which is an impact assessment impact assessment framework for invasive species impacts. We extracted the type of abiotic global environmental change, the type of the measured response. So we tried to categorize those into whether they measured abundance or a community diversity metric, some sort of nutrient analysis, etc. What type of ecosystem was included in the study, broadly categorized as freshwater, marine, or terrestrial. And then what type of experiment was it? Was it a field experiment? Was it a mesocosm? Or was it a lab or a greenhouse experiment? From that filtering, like I said, we identified 95 studies that spanned the years 1997 to 2020. We didn't set a early limit on the papers that we examined, but as you might imagine, we're using online digital databases, and so we are constrained by whatever years are included in those. And we did our final literature search in 2020, which is why that is the end year. We found a whole host of invasive species, broadly categorized into plants, animals, and fungi. I will say we have more plants represented in this body of literature than other types of organisms. About 73% of the invasive species that were in this database were plants. We intentionally searched for 6 different abiotic global environmental changes, and we found sufficient quantitative data for 3 of them to proceed with formal meta-analysis. And so those 3 were warming or increased temperature, drought or decreased precipitation, and nitrogen deposition. There were 3 global environmental changes that I'm just going to characterize as data deficient. We only found 1, 2, or maybe 3 papers for each of these types of abiotic change. So oxygen depletion, CO2 enrichment, and changes in pH or acidification. So we did look for those, but we didn't find enough papers in order to include them in the quantitative meta-analysis. And so one of the things that we're pulling from even this data assembly phase is where the information gaps are in these types of studies. And so those 3 abiotic global environmental changes are one of those data gaps. And ultimately, we extracted data for just over 450 cases. So there were 95 unique studies or unique papers. And then within that, there are certain times when multiple response variables were measured from the same experimental setup. And so we extracted data from all of those. And so they're all included in the data set, but they're controlled for with study level random effects in the models. And meta-analysis typically uses something called an effect size, which is, in simple terms, the difference between whatever the measured treatment response was from the control. In this study, we used Hedges D, which is one of the metrics that is commonly used. And I'm going to walk you through a conceptual diagram of the types of potential outcomes that we were looking for and characterizing. And so you've got the type of treatment on the x-axis, and then a representation of the effect size on the y-axis. And so there are 3 effect sizes that we can calculate from any of these studies. So one is the effect of the global environmental change. So that compares whatever the response of the organism or the community was to the environmental change relative to the control. We have the invasive species treatment effect size. So that's the effect of the invasive species on whatever the response. And then we have the combined treatment where the environmental change and the invasive species were applied together. And the magnitude and the direction of the interaction effect is what allows us to characterize the outcome of that interaction as something that is within the bounds of expectation or outside the bounds of expectation. And so the most straightforward expectation we might have is that there is an additive effect of the environmental change and invasive species when you combine them in a treatment. So if you add together the black bar and the white bar from the independent treatments, add those together, that's your predicted additive effect. And so we characterized any interactions as additive if they fell within the 95% confidence intervals of that predicted additive interaction. If the measured interaction fell somewhere between, in this case, 0 and the lower bound of, or the upper bound of the 95% confidence interval, we classified that as an antagonistic positive interaction. And if the response fell outside of the bounds of either of the individual effects, we called that a synergistic interaction. And so if it was well above those individual effects, it was called synergistic positive, so more positive than the expected range. And then if it was more negative than the additive expectation, that was synergistic negative. And so really this starts to get confusing with the nomenclature. And so the easiest way that I've found to think about antagonism and synergism is simply that synergism falls outside of the bounds of possible expectations from your measurements, and antagonisms falls within the bounds of possible outcomes of the interaction from your individual treatment measurements. Another way to think about it is if you've got this synergistic positive interaction, any management that you might do would have a negative effect on the ecosystem. Whereas if you applied management to a negative synergistic interaction, it would be a benefit, or it would be a positive for that ecosystem. And so then what did we find? If we take all of the data together, we find that invasive species effects are much more negative on average than the global environmental change effects. So here you're looking at mean effect size plus or minus a 95% credible interval from a Bayesian mixed model. And so what that means is that if the bar overlaps the 0 line, we would call that not significantly different than 0. Whereas, and those bars are shaded in gray throughout this talk. If the bar does not overlap 0, then we would say it's significantly different from 0, whether it be positive or negative. And so here we can see that the global environmental change is not significantly different from 0, highly variable, but not significantly different from 0. We do see an on average negative effect of the invasive species treatments and of the invasive species plus GEC treatments. I'm going to shorthand global environmental change to GEC from here forward. And the other thing to note is that the combined effect, the interactive effect of invasives and GEC is really not that different from the negative effect of invasive species alone. If we look at the classification of the type of interaction, we see that most of the interactions were classified as antagonistic. And so that's the lighter blue and the lighter red colors. And then about 25% of the cases were synergistic. And then of the synergistic interactions, those tended to be negative. So that's sort of like the worst case scenario, more often than they tended to be positive, which is sort of like an unexpected benefit to the ecosystem. But one of the things that we took away from this was the situation maybe isn't quite as bad as we might have anticipated. It's not that it's good for the ecosystem. We still have lots of negative effects happening, but we don't have as many negative synergistic interactions than we might have thought or might have feared from some of the literature that was starting to emerge. So it really underscored for us the importance of doing these synthetic analyses as well, because it really does allow the whole body of literature to speak without having, one paper or a small group of papers overwhelm the overall conclusion. We did also break apart some pieces of the treatments. So in this case, I'm going to pull apart the different GECs to assess whether they all sort of have similar effects or whether there are variable effects that might be helpful for thinking about management implications. And so first I'll say that drought as a GEC was across the board the GEC that had the most negative effects. You'll see that the GEC, the invasive species treatment, and the combined treatment all had negative implications for the native species and ecosystems. We also found a higher proportion of negative synergisms when drought was the focal GEC relative to the overall pattern. If we look at warming or temperature increase, the GEC treatment alone was not consistently positive or negative, but the invasive species treatment and the invasive species plus GEC treatment were both consistently negative. Here too, we saw a slightly higher proportion of negative synergisms than we did for the overall analysis. So far, what we're pulling from this is that drought and warming seem to be two of the more detrimental combinations with invasive species when we're looking at the interaction. Finally, we looked at nitrogen. And this was a case where we saw highly variable effects. And you'll notice that none of the effects, the GEC, the invasive species, nor the interactive effect, were significantly different from zero. We did find a slightly higher proportion of positive synergisms with nitrogen deposition, which really makes some amount of sense if you think about the proportion of plants that are represented in this data set. Plants in general are going to respond positively to nitrogen addition. And so the fact that we see some positive synergisms here is not wholly unexpected. So if we recap the findings, it's that invasive species often have negative effects overall, and if we sort of break apart the studies by individual GECs, and that the GEC effects were more variable, and that the worst effects that we observed for both treatments were with drought. So from this data set anyway, it really does elevate drought as one of the GECs that we should be taking a hard look at. When invasive species are combined with other GECs, the effects tend to be negative. That's generally true across the different analyses that I've presented. And also antagonistic effects are the most common. There was perhaps an expectation among our group that we were going to see a large number of synergisms. And synergisms, I'm not going to call them rare. We did observe them in about 25% of cases overall, but they were not the norm. They were not the common outcome. And sort of the segue to the next part of my talk is really that what these results tell us for sort of real world implications is that managing invasive species is still important for mitigating some of the effects of climate change, particularly drought and warming, as highlighted in this study. So invasive species on their own are problematic, but they also, in this multiple stressor context, perhaps provide a tangible or tractable approach to managing ecosystems for climate resilience. And so what do we mean by that? I mean that when we have ecosystems that are confronted with multiple challenges, with warming and invasive species, there's sort of a finite capacity to bounce back from those stressors. And if we can remove one of those stressors, if we can remove or prevent, even better, prevent invasive species, for example, it allows for some of that capacity to be allocated towards the other stressor, in this case, climate change. The results of this study also indicate that invasive species management is something that is worth doing. It's worth removing some of those negative impacts if and where we can. And I say that with a pretty strong asterisk next to it, because the type and the magnitude of the existing impacts is going to play a large role in how that ecosystem bounces back or how it recovers post-management, right? So like, here's an example. You've got a garlic mustard management where it's a pretty low input, easy to manage infestation. You can involve volunteers in order to do the pulling, depending on how big of a property and how big of an infestation we're talking about. There may be soil legacy effects of the species, but there are a number of ecosystem attributes that we would expect to rebound after this invasive species is removed. So it removes that stress without too much difficulty, and there's at least some amount of recovery capacity or resilience in the ecosystem to move back towards an earlier state. In other situations, though, like if we've gone past a tipping point, such as you have hemlock woolly adelgid and your hemlocks are already dead, removing that hemlock from the land, or removing the hemlock woolly adelgid from the landscape isn't really going to push that ecosystem back to its earlier state. It's already moved past, that threshold. And so all of the tools that land managers are using to make decisions about when, where, and how to manage invasive species are still going to be applicable in this case. What this research tells us, though, is that in cases where there is a reasonable chance of success with management and recovery capacity in the ecosystem, it may then build additional climate resilience because we're removing those negative impacts. And finally, and this is the part that I think is perhaps the most promising path forward, is that invasive species prevention and early detection and rapid response, so EDRR, really should be a priority. And there are 3 aspects to this that I think are worth noting. First is that prevention and EDRR are tangible at larger scales with coordinated policies and protocols. I'll get into that more in just a moment. That proactive regulation has the potential for dealing with ornamental plants and pet trade. And finally, that voluntary industry alternatives and helping to shape consumer demand can also play a role. So there's sort of multiple avenues by which prevention and EDRR can play an important role in ecosystem resilience. And so when we're thinking about coordination at large spatial scales, I'm talking about things like the EDRR protocols that the National Invasive Species Council are starting to pull together. So this is just a screen grab from their website and a figure from within a white paper that was produced earlier this year, where they're really starting to flesh out, okay, like what does an EDRR coordinated response look like? What are the components of it? What are the questions that we need to be asking in order to make it an efficient system? And then the white paper that this figure is pulled from specifically addresses the need for funding in order to respond to any detected threats that would be candidates for EDRR. So how do we actually take this from a nice theoretical idea and a policy statement to action on the ground? There are also regulatory options. Funding and enforcement still come into the conversation here because regulations without those things and without monitoring, they sound good, but they don't actually have much effect. And so I have 2 examples here. Since we've had some plant examples, here's some non-plant examples where Florida recently expanded their prohibited species list to include reptiles that are popular in the pet trade. And there are also international ballast water treaties and agreements to prevent the spread and introduction of marine invasive species. So these are more forward-thinking, perhaps not entirely proactive, but could be proactive policies and regulations to get ahead of new incursions. And finally, voluntary actions should always be a part of the equation. And so this is an example of a document that the Northeast Risk recently published that is aimed at the horticulture industry, so growers and sellers of plants, to provide a list of species that are invasive elsewhere in the United States. They're part of the ornamental trade in the United States, but they are not yet part of ornamental trade in the Northeast. So these aren't yet widely sold species, but they could be as climate continues to change. So these are species that we would expect to have more and more suitable climate in the Northeast over the next 10 to 20 years. And so the intent here is to say, okay, instead of selling these known invasive species and adding them to your inventory, here's a set of native alternatives that you might consider instead. So it's both a list of don't sell these things, but also consider selling these other beneficial plants instead. And the initial outreach that we've had with this document to nursery retailers has generally been positive. By and large, they're appreciative of knowing what are the things that they should be avoiding, and especially what are the things that consumers might want as native plants become more and more common in home landscapes, as well as their long-standing use in restoration landscapes. And so on the flip side of this, there's also the consumer demand side of things. So as individual consumers go into their retail nurseries and ask for native plants instead of invasive ones, that then also helps to drive nurseries towards native plants, which are going to be, certainly not detrimental and hopefully positive to our local ecosystems. So to wrap it up, and after this, I'm happy to answer whatever questions have arisen. Invasive species, this isn't news, but it's helpful to have this comprehensive quantitative data set to reinforce it, that invasive species often have negative effects across different ecosystem types, across different types of organisms. Our GEC effects, though, are more variable, but we see negative effects certainly with drought and with warming in combination with invasive species. Overall, invasive species and these other abiotic environmental changes tend to be negative. And so they're something that we need to be paying attention to and thinking about how to most effectively manage for them. And finally, that managing and, I'll underscore preventing invasive species is really going to be an important avenue for creating and maintaining climate resilient landscapes. If we think about, our landscapes almost like a rubber band where they've got a finite amount of, ability to stretch back to where they were, if we can remove some of the pressure that invasive species are putting on, then it allows some additional capacity for dealing with some of these other abiotic changes. So finally, I just want to say thank you again to the fabulous group of collaborators that were a part of this research. This stemmed from multiple working groups that you see pictured here. We've also had support from the Albert and Elaine Borchardt Foundation, from the CASC, from UMass, and from the Northeast Risk Management Network to get this paper together. And with that, I'll take questions.